It was the deadliest day in the history of the state of Israel, the deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust, the Hamas terror attacks inside Israel on October 7th, 2023. 1 year later, Israel is a nation scarred and a nation at war on multiple fronts with no end in sight. And the hostages who were taken by Hamas 1 year ago, many have not returned. It's feared that if and when they do come home, many will not be alive. I'm Brent Goff in Berlin. This is The Day.
It's really hard to be here after a year. In my worst nightmares.
Almost every morning is October 7 because we don't have my father and many others.
Since that black day, we have been fighting. This is the war of our existence, the war of resurrection.
I can't believe we've got to this point. We need a ceasefire.
The Israelis are the occupiers, and they need to know that these people we will fight.
We are changing the security reality in our region to ensure what happened on the 7th of October will not happen again.
To our viewers watching on PBS in the United States and to all of you around the world, welcome. We begin the day remembering a day Israel wishes that it could forget. On October 7th, 2023, the militant group Hamas carried out the unthinkable terror attacks inside Israel. Some 1,200 people were killed, making it the deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust. On Monday, Israelis marked the somber 1 year mark. Thousands of people attended a commemoration in Tel Aviv where a minute's silence was observed to honor the victims. Our first report takes us back to that tragic day and a warning: some of our viewers may find the images disturbing.
The sun was just about to rise when over 1,000 rockets were launched at Israel from Gaza. As millions of Israelis rushed to seek shelter, 1,500 Hamas-trained militants on land, sea and air broke through the Israel-Gaza border fence in more than 60 locations. Minutes later, they reached Israeli military bases and the nearing border communities. On their way, they shot indiscriminately at passers-by. All the while, the rocket barrage continued and various Palestinian militants and civilians kept flowing in through the broken fence. The fighting expanded to over 30 different locations in the south of Israel. One of these locations was the Nova Music Festival. Hundreds of bravers tried to flee for their lives. Cases of sexual violence, rape, and other atrocities were reported in the weeks and months that followed. The dimensions of the carnage were slowly exposed through videos posted online by Hamas. The picture was grim. An unprecedented terror attack had caught Israel by surprise. Whole families and communities had fallen in the hands of Hamas.
Citizens of Israel, we are at war, not in an operation, but at war.
In the first hours, Israeli security forces were flailing and civilians were mostly left alone to fight. Hamas was setting houses on fire, shooting hundreds to death, and has taken over 250 people, hostages, back to Gaza. Only after 48 hours did Israel regain control over all its territories and the breached border. On that day and in the year that passed since, over 1,600 Israelis were killed. Some 100 hostages are still held by Hamas. Israeli airstrikes on Gaza started that morning and soon followed by full-scale ground invasion. Over 41,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza in the war that followed October 7th, the day that changed the Middle East.
Well, I'm joined now by Omer Bartov. He is a professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Brown University. Professor Bartov, it's good to see you again. We appreciate you taking the time to talk with us on today, which is a very painful anniversary for Israelis and for Jewish people everywhere. How deep would you say the trauma is from October 7th?
Well, if you ask about Israel, I would say it's extremely deep. It hasn't gone away. It seems to be actually uh, changing society, sort of seeping in a way that may explain some of the way in which Israeli society is behaving right now. But it is very deep, and it's generally has not been worked through at all, I would say.
Yeah, you say the way Israeli society is behaving or changing right now. You wrote in The Guardian recently about a recent trip to Israel, and you talked about an inability to feel empathy for the people of Gaza. I want to bring up just a quote from what you wrote. You said that the impression that I got was consistent. We have no room in our hearts. We have no room in our thoughts. We do not want to speak about or to be shown what our own soldiers, our children or grandchildren, our brothers and sisters are doing right now in Gaza. We must focus on ourselves, on our trauma, fear, and anger. Those are strong words, Professor. Isn't what you observed the natural reaction of a people whose safety was seriously undermined by the October 7th terror attack? Or do you think it goes beyond self-preservation?
Well, I mean, it does go beyond self-preservation. In a sense, it's counterproductive. When you said the inability for empathy, since you are speaking to me from Berlin, I was thinking about the famous text, the inability to mourn, that came out in the 60s regarding Germany's response to what happened in World War II. I think it's the mechanism that I see in Israel now is not simply that people find it difficult to think about what they're doing to others because they're so engaged in what they're doing, what had happened to them, but it's a kind of paralysis that occurs in society where people are so bewildered and so shocked that they can't think beyond the immediate actions that are happening. They can think tactically, but they can't think strategically or politically. And that is everywhere. It's in the lower echelons of society, and also, it seems to me, in the higher echelons of the military, and certainly in politics. And that, in a sense, makes for an unending war. And if you think about an unending war, a war without clear political objectives, it becomes an absolute war. And that's really the implication of this inability to see what you're doing to others and what is the purpose of it. What are you actually trying to accomplish?
Is it fair to compare what is happening right now inside Israel and to the Israelis with what happened in the United States and to the Americans after 9/11? I mean, there was also this trauma. There was also the war against terror. There was the war in Iraq. But at some point, that war faded away, it seemed.
Yes, I mean, and President Biden, when he came to Israel on his famous visit and gave Netanyahu a bear hug, and thought that that way he could then persuade him and the Israeli public to see things the way he saw them. His warning was, don't do what we did. Don't lash out. Think about what you're doing. And so in that sense, yes, there was a fear that that would happen. And that is indeed what happened. But there's some major differences. One difference is that America went to wage a war in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's very far from the United States. Israel is waging a war on its own borders. In fact, in the Gaza Strip is officially still in occupied territory, and now in Lebanon. So that's right there. The second thing is that there is, on the one hand, you can say, as many people have said, that the Prime Minister Netanyahu really wants to have the war go on, because if the war stops, just like in American cartoons, he will fall. His coalition will dissipate. Any agreement that he reaches will be the end of his coalition, would be the end of, he fears that at least, would be the end of his premiership. But behind that, there is actually a strategy. And I believe that what Netanyahu is trying to do right now, and we've seen indications of that just in the last 2 days, is actually to take over total control of Gaza, to empty at least the top third of it, of the population, and to gradually annex the whole territory and push as many people as he can out. And that's very different from what the United States was doing in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Well, he can only do that with the force of the IDF, of the Israeli military. And, you know, for our viewers who may not know, you know, you grew up in Israel, you served in the Israeli military. Earlier this summer, you were back in Israel. I know you spoke with Israeli soldiers and reservists. Are they thinking differently than your generation of soldiers in Israel thought when you were possibly, you know, facing military battle?
Yeah, I was a soldier around the war of 1973 and the subsequent war of attrition. I was in the Syrian enclave at the time, what was called. Yes, look, I mean, the Israeli army has changed, definitely, in many ways. The most important way that I can think of it changing is that now the lower echelons of the army, increasingly mid-echelons, so you're talking brigade commanders, divisional commanders, and going even higher, come from a different part of society. We were mostly secular, sort of supporters of the Labour Party in general. And what you have now are more and more national religious elements, which are much more extreme politically. So the army, in that sense, is motivated by a different worldview from the one that we had, and that coincides with what I was just saying. So I think that many soldiers do want to eradicate the problem and believe that they can do it with bombs. I don't think it's possible, but I think that's a general direction. And the government right now, Netanyahu and the people around him, are very much trying to accomplish this goal, although they don't always say it openly, certainly not Netanyahu himself.
You and I spoke, Professor, here on this program just a few weeks after the October attacks last year. And I remember asking you if Israel's actions in Gaza at the time constituted genocide. I'd be interested to hear how your views have evolved over the past year, or have they changed?
They have changed. I think I wrote in this piece in The Guardian that came out in August that, in November, I published an op-ed in the New York Times, November last year, saying that there were probably war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by the IDF, but I didn't think it was genocide yet. But I was warning that it's good to warn against it now so as to make sure that it doesn't happen. But of course, things continued. The U.S., which is the main power broker there because it's the main supplier of arms to Israel, second place is, of course, Germany itself, continued supporting Israel, did not broker a ceasefire, could not force Israel's hand. And by May, I would say, when Israel went into Rafah, I think I felt that I could no longer deny that what we were seeing is actually a genocidal campaign whose goal is to destroy the Palestinian people in Gaza as such, to make the place completely uninhabitable for Palestinians. And that has been happening. That is, the population has been displaced multiple times. There are at least 41,000 people killed. There are thousands of people under the debris. There are tens and tens of thousands, close to 100,000 who've been wounded. And we don't know how many people are under the debris, and the long-term repercussions of this ongoing humanitarian disaster that has continued now for a whole year, and nobody seems to be able to stop it. So that will have long-term repercussions on any ability of Palestinians to live in that place. So I think, yes, by now we can certainly say that we're watching genocide unrolling without anybody stopping it.
Professor Omer Bartov joining us tonight. Professor, we appreciate your time. We appreciate your insights as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Etgar Keret is one of Israel's most acclaimed contemporary authors, and he joins me now from Tel Aviv. Welcome to TW. Thank you so much for your time today. You're a writer, a storyteller. Can I ask you what words you would use to describe Israel today, 1 year after the October the 7th attacks?
Well, I think that a year may have passed, but for people who live in Israel, I think we're still trapped in that day, very, very much like a Groundhog Day. Because in this year, a lot of events had happened, a lot of deaths, victories, losses, but fundamentally, nothing had changed. We still have the same government. Our prime minister didn't even conduct one interview with Israeli newspaper or media body. There is no appointed investigative committee. There's no talk about going to re-election, which would have been the natural thing to do after such a catastrophe. So the idea is, and more than that, we don't have any sense of future, because when we look at Gaza 1 year after the war, I don't know what Netanyahu is planning. He doesn't share this information with us. He doesn't tell us how does he see Gaza the day after the war ends. And he keeps all the cards to his chest. And in that sense, basically does nothing, freezes the strategical picture, freezes the political picture, freezes all of our future, while incidents keeps rolling on. You know, Israel had a lot of wonderful successes in the war against Lebanon, but they are worth nothing if they are not leveraged to an agreement. Netanyahu keeps talking about total victory. This term does not exist. After the war is over, Israel, the Palestinian people, the Lebanese people will need to live one by each other. So the same thing would be to try to leverage our successes to get an agreement that could get the kidnapped people back from Gaza.
And can I ask you, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but can I ask you, I mean, 100 hostages are still being held in Gaza. I know that you, as many other Israelis, have been protesting for months for an agreement. So why has there been no deal, in your opinion?
Well, I think that both of the sides, you know, the Hamas and the Netanyahu, were very tough customers. I understand why the head of a terrorist organization holding hostages could be cold-blooded and be very tactical and strategical. But at the other end, I can't understand how a prime minister is responsible for the kidnapping of civilians from their homes cannot say this is the most important thing. Reaching this deal is on top of my priority. By the way, this is getting your prisoners back is considered the prime and most important Jewish mitzvah. Mm-hmm. Everyone who's a Jew knows about, they call it Pidyon Shvuim. There's nothing more important than to return the people who are yours back, you know. And in that sense, you know, I think that in the 7th of October, basically, there is something about the Jews who live in Israel had returned to some kind of a diaspora. The idea of Israel as being a safe haven, a place in which all Jews can live and not be intimidated was broken. But at the same time, it feels like a diaspora because you have some kind of a government that is supposed to represent your interests, but doesn't share any information with you, doesn't share the future that it plans for you.
It's quite clear, your criticism of Benjamin Netanyahu and his government, you are making that very clear. So I'd like to ask you, many Israelis do seem to support the war in Gaza, and opinion polls are showing that support for Netanyahu is actually increasing again. What do you say to that?
Well, first of all, support for Netanyahu is increasing, but it is still extremely low. I would say that in the polls that I saw, a third support him and 2/3 want re-election. Now, when you're prime minister in a time of an existential war, you should have a 90% support rate. You know, people do not want to criticize the leader, but I think that in this case, there is very little alternative. You know, Netanyahu had started the judicial reform 2 years ago. His Minister of Defense had warned him. He said it puts us in a great and immediate danger. Netanyahu wanted to fire him. This idea of frozen word is that Netanyahu, who sent him a letter firing him before the war, is still firing him. He didn't go back on his word. He says, oh, I'm firing the guy. But in these 14 months, the guy who is basically responsible for the war that we are wielding is hanging in a limbo. I'm saying there is something here that is totally irrational.
Can I ask you, because we have very little time left, but I'd love to ask you, you've made very clear your thoughts about the situation today, the political situation. Obviously, the situation in Israel today is a very difficult one, but let's just look ahead for one moment. What do you think is needed to build a better future? Briefly, if you can.
I think that we are in a horrible position right now, but I do think that the Middle East can seize an opportunity in the situation that was created. Because I think that right now, when there is the Saudi Accord on the table, which Israel can join, when a process is starting the creation of a Palestinian state is being conducted with the support of the entire world, that make agreements with Lebanon, one that will push Hezbollah aside, would promise the free people a better future. So, and of course, at the same time, it's a great opportunity to push Iran outside, away from countries and away from proxies. But all those kind of things should be done together. The idea is not getting a total victory, but it's creating an existence in which we can all live in.
Etgar Keret, thank you so much for your time today. It was a pleasure having you on the programme.
Thank you.
And I'm joined in the studio now by Gil Murciano, CEO of Mitvim. That's a think tank that focuses on foreign security and peace policy. Welcome to DW. It's a pleasure to have you here. The Hamas attack on October the 7th left Israel reeling. 1 year later, can you tell us how much support is there for the war in Gaza?
I think that's what differentiates the war in Gaza from the war in Lebanon that we're currently experiencing. When it comes to Gaza, we are talking about a crisis of trust, I think, between large parts of the population and the government. And the major issue is about the ability of the government to stop the incremental continuation of this Gaza disaster and offer an alternative to Hamas, to kind of take the military achievements that were achieved with major human suffering from the Palestinian side and the human cost, and turn them or convert them into some kind of a new approach or some kind of a new horizon on that level. At the core of the things, of course, we're talking about the hostage situation. You mentioned before the Israeli society in a state of deep post-trauma. I would even say it's a continuous trauma, an unsolved trauma with 101 hostages dying, slowly dying inside Hamas tunnels. And I think what connects the inability of the government to offer an alternative and the hostages issue is the feeling in Israel that most of the obstacles to achieve those goals are related to the political motivation of the Netanyahu government and not necessarily to the circumstances.
The Israeli government, the Netanyahu government, has so far failed to prevent a realistic plan for Gaza. Is that something that is discussed, talked about a lot in Israel?
Well, I mean, I think that right now, when we do see this ongoing return of Israeli forces from the north to the south, this vacuum that is left behind by the lack of action or lack of political action, we do understand that in many cases you see a line that is presented by the right-wing side of this right-wing government. It is mainly about conflict management and not really about creating any kind of decisive solution. Now, one of the conceptual victims of 7th of October is this approach that the Israeli public used to support of conflict management, of postponing decisions, of continuing the situation as it is. I think that the Israeli society right now looks for decisive action, for major steps, whether they are in the direction of the right-wing settlement approach or whether it is regarding major peace solutions or diplomatic solutions, is still a source of polarization in the Israeli society.
And can I ask you also about how the Israeli public views the fact that Israel has been accused of committing war crimes, of genocide in Gaza. How do Israeli people view those allegations?
Well, one of the most frustrating things for us, I mean, experts and organizations that promote international law, that actually try and encourage a re-examination of Israeli usage of military power and so on, humanitarian strategy, is actually the declining integrity in Israeli view of those human rights organizations. And I would say a year after 7th of October is also a reckoning day for the human rights community altogether. And it's not just the one-sided approach, the tendency the first months to ignore reports about sexual violence that were mentioned by the victims of 7th of October of the Hamas attack. It's not just about using the harshest terms, the genocide term, when we had our share of genocides in the Middle East, but it's mainly about the easiness in which the genocide claim was used or been turned into a political tool to question the right of Israel to exist. So the Israeli public narratives, and not completely without merits, see some kind of a division of labor between Hamas, who were aiming on the 7th of October to physically annihilate the state of Israel, and between certain actors that are, through non-violent political campaign, are promoting the same aid, non-violently, but again, the same aim of challenging the right of Israel to exist. And while we think it's probably really marginal, when we are trying to push forward the need for Israel and for the Israeli public to push for a humanitarian strategy for Gaza, and issues as such, we are dealing with an integrity that was reduced to zero of the international human rights community.
Israel's allies, like the US, like Germany, say that without a two-state solution, there can be no lasting peace. So what kind of long-term solution, so looking to the future, what kind of long-term solution do you think the Israeli public wants to see?
Actually, this is a very interesting point, because the common perception is that the Israeli public went all the way right after the war. And that's what we used to think. And then when we started serving and examining the Israeli public, what we identify is that when Israelis are being asked to think long-term, then the majority of them, a small majority, 45 to 50%, actually choose the diplomatic solution, whether it is Gaza or the West Bank or Lebanon or Tehran. You see this emergence of I wouldn't say left wing, but a pragmatic small majority within the Israeli public, consistently supporting options that bring in a broader framework that includes regional and international actors. For example, a majority of Israelis supports, word by word, the establishment of a demilitarized Palestinian state, as long as it's part of a regional normalization and a US security umbrella. So we see those changes, and that really opens up a discussion about the idea of outlining a vision from the international community, and the fact that they basically share the same opinion with, I wouldn't say a broad majority, but with a small majority in the Israeli public. Basically the option of speaking to the Israeli audience above the heads of the government in many ways.
But it's a small majority, as you say. I mean, do you see that growing? Do you see that kind of thinking getting more prolific amongst?
Not so much. I think that when we speak about the Keret campaign in Lebanon, which obviously enjoys, a different level of support within the Israeli public, I think there are some changes and there are some discussions. We do see, the good news is this majority that is forming, but the bad news is that in this crucial juncture, no more delaying strategic options. We also see almost a third of the Israeli public that adopts positions that used to be affiliated with the extreme right in Israel. The annexation of the West Bank and Gaza, resettlement. So we do see the risk and the opportunity here. And what we are looking for today is some kind of a leading figure in the Israeli opposition. And the Israeli opposition is also in crisis if you're following the current discussion about the composition of the coalition.
Gil Murciano, CEO of the Israeli Institute for Regional Foreign Policy. Gil, thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate it.
And in Tel Aviv right now, a commemoration is getting underway. The memorial was organized by the families of victims and hostages. Tens of thousands of tickets for the event had been reserved, but for security reasons, only 2,000 people have been allowed to attend. DW's Emily Gordine, she is in Tel Aviv following this memorial for us. Emily, just describe, if you can, what the mood is like there right now.
Well, the mood is solemn, Brent. This is a day that people are commemorating, which a lot of people here associate with the worst day of their lives. And at the same time, given what many see as the successes of the military of the IDF in the north, it's also a day of mixed feelings. Looking at according to the Jewish calendar, Israel is going into a new year now, and asked how they feel about it, they say they are optimistic, and also being here today, they also know that this is overshadowed by the attacks on October 7. Now, right now, we're just seeing the commemoration has just started, and we're standing in Hostage Square in the middle of Tel Aviv, a place where families of hostages camped out after the attacks. This is a place where a lot of people have been demonstrating over the past year for the release of the hostages, and right now the commemoration has just started here behind me, the public viewing of the ceremony that bereaved families have been organising in Tel Aviv for tonight.
And Emily, we know that this cannot be an easy time, particularly for the families of the people who died a year ago, but also for the families of the hostages and hostages that are still being held in Gaza. Do we know how are these families, how are they coping?
Well, a lot of families are supported psychologically. They are getting psychological support, but many say that this is a day, this is an experience they will never forget and that will haunt them their entire lives. And other families who still have relatives held hostage in Gaza by Hamas, they have been relentlessly going out, taking to the streets every Saturday evening, calling for their release, making their voices heard with various demonstrations across the country, because they know that the only way they will ever get a restful sleep ever again in their lives is when the hostages are returned to them, when their family members and their friends are back.
And Emily, I understand that this is not the only ceremony that is planned for today. Some called this one an unofficial commemoration, right?
That's right, and it ultimately reflects the deep division and the deep distrust many feel towards the Israeli government. Many see that it was down to the government's failure to protect them on that fateful day on October 7 last year, when over 6,000 Hamas militants crossed the border from Gaza into Israel and killed over 1,200 people and took many hundreds hostage. And many people have been, they've been demanding a hostage deal. They want to see their family members and friends back. But so far, over the past year, we've seen very little progress on a hostage deal. And this ceremony is meant to not only highlight the bravery and heroism of many people that day, but also of the shortcomings and the failures of that day, something that they don't think the government is currently facing.
Yeah, and obviously the biggest shortcoming since that day is the fact that not all of the hostages have been released and returned home. What is known about the situation of those hostages? I think there's about 100 people who are still, we believe, are still being held.
That's right. A little over 100 hostages are still believed to be kept in Gaza. However, when you talk to officials in Israel, but also to ordinary Israeli citizens, there is very little hope that many of them are still alive, and the question of whether they will ever be returned is also a very big one. Apologies for that. But essentially what we're seeing in Israel right now is the attention focusing on the northern border, on the northern front, on the fight with Hezbollah. And that's also something that many hostage families have been heavily criticizing the government for, that they are shifting the focus, the attention away from the hostages. And they say that ultimately the only way that we're going to get through this is if we have a ceasefire and a hostage deal, as the only way to also heal this country again.
Okay, DW's Emily Gourdine in Tel Aviv there. on the ground for us as Israel marks 1 day since the Hamas terror attacks. Emily, thank you. We'll be coming back to you a little bit later. Well, more than 100 people were killed or taken hostage in one kibbutz close to Israel's border with Gaza. Nir Oz was unprotected by Israeli soldiers, allowing Hamas to rampage through the community for hours. 1 year on, it remains deserted. DW's Tanya Kramer, she has visited the kibbutz, and a warning, some of you may find the images in her report disturbing.
Every Saturday is the same for Yair Moses. For the past 12 months, he's come here to Hostages Square in Tel Aviv. Hamas-led militants kidnapped Yair Moses' extended family. They took his mother, his father, his father's partner and her daughter and her 2 granddaughters. His father's partner was killed. Last November, they released the remaining women, but are still holding his father, Gadi Moses.
For us, almost every morning is October 7 because we don't have my father and many others. And now we come to this date, a year passed, and we start all the memorials and everything. So everything is coming back, and it's getting harder to sleep, harder to do anything.
This is where his family lived, near Oz, only a few kilometers from the Gaza border. Hamas-led militants invaded the kibbutz at around 6:30 in the morning. Of the about 400 people who lived here, over a quarter were either kidnapped or murdered. A year on, time seems to have stood still in Nir Oz. Most residents haven't returned. Yair Moses has come with other family members to check on his father's house.
Inside the house. All the floor here was full of the content of this cupboard. I try to stay on the positive side, but it's getting harder every day, every minute. It's getting more and more hard to think how he's coping, how is he well. Actually, we don't even know if he's alive.
The Moses family is not an exception. Every house in Nir Oz has a story to tell of loss and survival, pain and trauma. Doreen Ray and her family survived the attack. They now live in temporary accommodations about an hour away.
We have all of kinds of bad things that happen here. And it's all around the kibbutz. We see in the WhatsApp group of the mothers, it was crazy. Help us, we are burning. Help us, they shooting. Help us, they here, they are here. Come, please help us, help us.
Traces of the militants who tore through their home are still visible. Doreen and her family sheltered in this safe room for hours, while militants ripped their home apart and tried to get into their safe room. News trickled in about what was happening.
In 1 o'clock I get message. Some friend of mine asked me if I know this woman with the 2 kids that taking hostage. And I said, wow, this is Shiri with the kids, a friend of mine. So then I understand that they also not just trying to kill, they also take us. So in my mind I start to think what to do. If they will kill us and they will take the kids, what will happen? We need to die, all of us together. So it was not easy to think that you want to die with your kids. You want your kids will be dead with you.
The Israeli army did not arrive at the kibbutz until around 2 in the afternoon, almost 7 hours after the attack began. For many Israelis, Nir Oz is a symbol of the country's security failures.
The buildings over there, it's Gaza Strip.
It's over there in Gaza where Israel's war has killed at least 41,000 Palestinians, according to Gaza's health ministry. For Yair Moses, it is most important that his government now agrees to a hostage deal before they have to bury more of those who were taken to Gaza.
We've been here to the graveyard too many times in the last this period, And each time we say, okay, they're probably 5-6 kilometers from me, let's go and bring them. They're so close, but they're so far.
It's been a year. The situation remains unresolved, leaving people like Yair and Doreen trapped in time.
Yeah, trapped in time. I mean, it has to be a horrible place for the relatives, wanting their relatives to come home alive. We know for some of them that's not going to happen, but we don't even have...
It's also a vicious lottery. Yeah. Many of them don't know what's the state of their loved ones.
Where we have no plan. I mean, there's no plan on the horizon either that would at least give them a reason to hope that their relatives will be brought back.
Correct.
And why do you think Netanyahu seems to be so reluctant to give them, that tangible hope?
Well, if you ask Netanyahu, we'll tell you, I'm not the problem. Sinwar is the problem. Hamas is a problem. They are just not willing to budge. And we are not willing to agree with their conditions because we need to be able to control Gaza better. Some of the conditions that Israel have laid out in the plan that President Biden back then a few months ago already have brought up to the public. But also, Netanyahu doesn't really have, you were talking about an end game, and this is part of the bigger problem that we're talking about. Because Hamas wants Israel to end the war. Anything before that, anything short of that, they have no interest in maintaining or accommodating. Why would they lose what they see as the most, strategic asset, which are the hostages, and then still have, allow Israeli military to be operating freely in Gaza Strip? What do they gain out of it?
So you're right, they have no leverage if they give the hostages back.
Correct. And for Netanyahu, this is far from being, he cannot let that happen. On the contrary, we've just seen the Israeli military extending its operation in Gaza after many, many weeks of sort of a dormant operations, extending it even further deeper into Gaza and now in the northern part next to Jabalia, which was quite quiet for quite some time.
But the message here then seems to be, Netanyahu has said, we want the complete destruction of Hamas. And in order to reach that, then we may have to, and I'm not quoting him, I'm just saying this is what it sounds like, we may have to sacrifice the hostages in order to get to the complete destruction of Hamas.
This is, of course, nothing he would never admit. Netanyahu insists throughout the last year that both goals for the war, which are eradicating Hamas and bringing back the hostages, that they do not compete with each other. Reality have proven us that it might not be the case ever since then. But he keeps feeling, it's not like we're talking about the idea of extending its operations into Jabalia just yesterday. He feels that more pressure on Hamas will bring more willingness for concessions from Hamas. And this is the Netanyahu strategy. We've seen it also with Hezbollah in Lebanon. Pressure, and more pressure, because he feels that only military operation can help. And again, if we're talking about how October 7th, what it changed, for Israel and for the Middle East at all, in general, I think Israel realized that containment, which is how it saw the way it's operating vis-a-vis the Palestinians, is no longer effective. They say we were willing to play along because we thought both sides wanted, but now we realize the only way is to show more and more and more power. We have to build up deterrence. We have to show that they feel like this is the only way to win in the Middle East.
I've heard numerous times the comparison made between 9/11 in the United States and October 7th in Israel. Following 9/11, there was this just groundswell of public support for the United States. It had been the victim of a terrorist attack. That support was, destroyed by the war in Iraq that followed. Now you have something similar with Israel. There was this groundswell of public support, but when the numbers started to increase in Gaza, we saw that support erode practically overnight.
Correct.
Is that a correct? I mean, is that a proper analogy, would you say?
I think it is, and also because the numbers have started piling, and we're talking always about the end game. What does Israel want at the end of this? So how do we're a year in, and Israel is nowhere close to eradicating Hamas. Hamas is not just a terror organization. It's an idea. It's a movement that has very strong, support among its people. And we are talking about the need. I mean, even for example, the Jordanian foreign minister, who's been going viral in the last days, talking about how the region will support Israel as long as always they will support and understand and accommodate a Palestinian state or a two-state solution. And this is something Netanyahu, I don't know whether it's because of his ideology or whether because he's in the hands of the extreme right ministers in his government. This is something that Netanyahu cannot agree for, and this is the key that can probably open and turn the situation in the whole Middle East to a completely different direction. Okay. But this is just a key he cannot right now use.
All right.